is like when you're an undergraduate, you write down what you think the professor wants to hear to get the grade. And then you're a graduate student and you have to, let's say, get along with your professors and your supervisor. You have to tell them what you think they want to hear so that you can get your PhD. And then maybe you are on the academic track and you're an assistant professor. There's 3 levels of being a professor. You're not tenured as an assistant. So you really can't say what you think or do what you think you should do then because you have to get tenured. And then when you're tenured, well, you're not a full professor yet. And so you don't speak then. And back in the back of your mind, you have this idea, well, at some point, I'll have enough security so that I'll be able to tell the truth. But that's based on this weird idea that the courage to tell the truth is based on security. Well, courage isn't based on security. That's a stupid theory. You're not courageous if there's no risk. So your notion is you'll be courageous when there's 0 risk. Well, obviously that's a contradiction in terms. You're only courageous if there's a risk. And not only that, by the time you've sacrificed your word for illusory security for 15 years, there's nothing left of you that's true. That's gone a long time ago. You probably look back at the former self who was naive and thought that you could say what you think as just, well, you're cynical about it. You know, that person just didn't know how the world worked. And then it's the same thing that you pointed out. The idea that you become good because you have material plenty, that's a silly idea. Why would that be the case?
It's like the same as assuming that all rich people have got taste.
Right,
There's
right.
poor people who've got beautifully designed interiors and rich people who've got gaudy messes.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
There was
well, then the poor people are actually rich.
Absolutely. There's a report. I wanted to bring this to you. It's so interesting. So a recent report was released by the Harvard Graduate School of Education detailing the drivers of anxiety for young adults aged 18 to 25. 34% reported feelings of loneliness. 51% said achievement pressure negatively impacted their mental health. 58% reported lacking meaning or purpose in their lives in the last month. 50% reported that their mental health was negatively influenced by not knowing what to do with my life. There has been much examination of the well-being of teens aged 14 to 17. Not much has been known about those occupying the critical young adult years, and yet young adults report roughly twice the rates of anxiety and depression as teens. The young adults are not okay.
Yeah, I believe that. I saw even with my own kids that like when I was a kid, probably the time between 13 and 15 was the most difficult transition. But I saw that become older by the time my kids are 30 now, basically. By the time my kids were young adults, I could see that transition into adulthood was the place where the difficulties were starting to mount. I think perversely that the therapeutic world has a fair bit to do with this. Partly because therapists who are basically secular liberal Protestants, that's a good way of thinking about them, tend to conceptualize mental health as subjective, right? It's like mental health is something you carry around in your head, like you carry around your identity. That's why we have these ridiculous ideas that you can just define your own identity. I am whoever I say I am. Well, obviously you're not, because other people have to go along with your game there, buddy. And they're either going to do that, they're not going to do it, or they're going to do it voluntarily, or they're going to do it by force. If they're not going to do it, you're screwed. If you have to use force, that's not going to work. And if you want them to do it voluntarily, then it's not going to be all about you. Obviously, even no 4-year-old can find someone to play with if he always gets to pick the game. Okay, so why might young adults be lost? Well, part of it is that they're thinking, I'm not trying to be judgmental of a whole generation. It's a form of thought. Your mental health isn't dependent on you. That's not the right way to think about it. I don't think you can be mentally healthy in the absence of a long-term stable relationship. So you have to be married. Let's make that part of the precondition for successful adaptation as a young adult. You have to be married. So you have to establish a relationship with someone that integrates sexuality, that's there for the long run. Because there for the long run is the same as sane. There for tomorrow, there for the next minute, that's not sanity, that's impulsiveness. That's aimlessness. They're the same thing. If it's all about what you want right now, or more accurately, all about what something in you wants this moment, that's the definition of immature insanity. You have to commit. So you commit to someone else, you commit to your family, you commit to your community. Like, there are multiple levels of identity that stretch out into the social world. And voluntarily adopting those levels of hierarchical responsibility gives you an identity. It gives you a purpose. It protects you from anxiety. It does that in all sorts of ways. Like, you said earlier that one of the things you do is seek for validation, and you related that to uncomfortable experiences you had when you were very young. Well, it might not be precisely that you're seeking for validation. You might be properly investigating how you should be embedded in a social hierarchy at every possible level. It's like, well, people think their mental health is something that they just carry around in their head, and that if they just got the way they looked at the world right, or if other people just played their game, that all of a sudden they'd be mentally healthy. It's like, there's no difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable. Technically, if you look at, you can group descriptive statements about yourself statistically. All the descriptors that are reflective of self-consciousness load on negative emotion.
Can you not think about yourself in a positive way?
Probably not.
Really?
Not. Well, let's take that apart. You like doing your podcast and you feel positive about it. Okay, but your podcast isn't about you, right? So if you're thinking about how you're of utility to a broad number of people, maybe you would take some satisfaction in that, but that isn't exactly thinking about yourself, is it? It's thinking about the relationship you've established with other people, and it's a relationship of responsibility. Why do you like your podcast? You can pursue what you're curious about, but you wouldn't have to do that publicly. Okay, so why do you do it publicly?
For a few reasons. First one being that it keeps me accountable. That was one of the main reasons, that it kept me accountable, because I knew that if I didn't do it, if I wasn't rigorous and precise and aligned with what I'd said and done previously, that there was an external eye that's watching.
Okay. So, well, that's very interesting. So I would also say that's not exactly about you. That's about your ability to establish harmony between what you say and the way you act, and the expectations that an increasingly broad social community has of you as a consequence of what you say and how you act. Okay, that's not about you. That's about your nesting in a social hierarchy, right? And so I think you can, and then you might say too, well, maybe you're thinking about yourself when you're establishing an aim or a goal. Well, not if they're good aims or goals, because if they're good aims or goals, and I would say what good means technically is an aim or goal that will play out well in the medium to long term across a multitude of situations, including many, many people. So a solution that iterates across time, that is situation independent, and that's broadly socially inclusive, is a better aim, right? It's a higher aim because it integrates more. All right. Now, you might want to be setting up aims, and you might be pleased about how you're progressing in relation to those aims. But if those aims don't have the characteristics that I just described, then if the aims have the characteristics I just described, they're not about you. And then we could also ask, what do you mean about you? Exactly. What you are you talking about here? And so we play these identity games in the modern world that are making people anxious and hopeless. And one identity game is, I'm defined by my sexuality. Okay, so let's take that. I'm defined by my sexuality. Okay, but what do you mean by your sexuality exactly? Do you mean the opportunity to engage in sex? Like, are you reducing sexuality as such to the act of sex? Okay, let's say you are. So now what you're telling me is that who you are is who you are when you're sexually desirous. That's what you've reduced yourself to. But it's even more than that. It's the kind of sexual desire that wants gratification right now with no relationship whatsoever. So not only have you now reduced who you are to your sexual desire, you've reduced your sexual desire to the minimal set of preconditions that would satisfy it. Well, then the first question that might come up there is, why not just use porn? It's a lot simpler. And the answer to that is what people are doing. Well, it's no wonder that they're anxious and lonesome and aimless, because they've reduced themselves to a short-term desire. They've found the easiest possible way of gratifying that, and they've abandoned everything that would be a much broader conceptualization of what sexuality would be if it was embedded properly in, well, how about a relationship to start with?